Chris Minns is gearing up to turn nurses and midwives into killers, and we need to tell him we don't want this in New South Wales. It's a Greens plan, but it will take Labor and Chris Minns to get it over the line. Why do they want to do this? How are they going to do it? And that's today on The Dr. Jo Show. Abortion was made legal up to birth in New South Wales in 2019, and there was a huge fight. It was a Liberal government, Gladys Berejiklian, who was the Premier at the time. And it was a coalition, essentially, of pro-abortion, Liberal, Labor, Greens and independent MPs who made this happen. The people of New South Wales, it was very clear that they were uncomfortable with this. The Daily Telegraph had a number of headings about their concerns around this, around abortion up to birth. The people turned out en masse. There was over 10,000 that marched through Martin Place saying they didn't want this to happen. But ultimately, the pro-abortion forces in the parliament and pro-abortion sections of the media, so the Sydney Morning Herald, the ABC, the Guardian, they were all aggressively pushing this abortion up to birth legislation under the smokescreen of decriminalisation. So this is something that's happened everywhere. It's not like the pro-abortion side came out swinging and said, we want abortion up to birth for any reason. That wasn't what they said. They said, we want decriminalisation. We don't want women going to jail for having an abortion. And the reality was no woman had gone to jail in anyone's recent memory in New South Wales. Abortion was largely liberalised and available. But the difference that this legislation made was that after a certain point, after viability, it could happen with the approval of 2 doctors for any reason. And that was what the real contribution of the legislation was. It wasn't decriminalising it. It was making it available and legal all the way through. They didn't say that's what it was about. That's what it was about. And that's how they got it over the line, essentially by selling a lie that the mainstream media really propagated. Only the Daily Telegraph really asked questions about this and had some critical articles. But on the whole, everybody just fell into line. At the time, they said they would do a 5-year review of the abortion laws. And here we are 5 years later, and this review has just landed. So it's a report that was published in September 2024, but wasn't actually made publicly available until late last week. And the timing is very interesting because there has been this pro-abortion campaign through The Guardian, the ABC, and the Sydney Morning Herald with academics and the Greens. I talked about this in my second episode of The Dr. Jo Show, which talks about this fake abortion access crisis that has been manufactured by the pro-abortion establishment because they want abortion to be free, they want it to be available in every town centre, and they want every health worker to perform it regardless of whether they want to or not. They want to override conscientious objection. So I talked about that in the second episode of the show, that this has been a brewing campaign for some months. But what we see now is this report by New South Wales Health, which is meant to be this 5-year review of the abortion up to birth legislation. It essentially is now the next step in this campaign to get free abortion everywhere, performed by everyone. And so, surprise, surprise, the review is a stitch-up. It's literally the shoddiest, worst review that I have ever seen done by a government department. It's a normative piece of work written by pro-abortion authors who want to see a pro-abortion outcome. The way that this report has been done, let me tell you about the methodology. So they wrote to the abortion stakeholders. They essentially wrote to people that are in the business of abortion. 35 responded, and the entire report is based on anecdotal evidence from these 35 abortion stakeholders. So people like, let me get the list out, Mary Stopes International, the biggest abortion clinic in the country, Family Planning New South Wales, which has a vested interest in more abortion, Clinic 66, Gynecology Centres Australia, Macquarie Street Clinic, the private clinic, and so on. Everyone that they inquired about is in the system of abortion, and largely speaking, on that list of the 35, they all have a vested interest in abortion. I saw that there was 1 or 2 Catholic hospitals in there, so St Vincent's, for example, in Sydney. They probably gave evidence critical of the legislation, but overwhelmingly of those 35 stakeholders, 98% are in the business of abortion and want more abortion. So if you do a review and you write a report that essentially targets a group that wants a certain outcome, the report's going to say that we should get that outcome. That's not surprising. You know, if I go to my toddler and say, do you want more lollies? Their answer is going to be, yeah, of course I want more lollies. If you go to abortion providers and say, what's wrong with the system? They're going to say, well, there's all these barriers and we want more abortion, because that's where their paycheck comes from. That's what they're passionate about. And so it's unsurprising that this review is not a robust piece of analysis of the first 5 years of the abortion law reforms in New South Wales. It's a stitch up. And so what's really striking from what comes out in this report is the absence of data. There is no quantitative data about the number of abortions that have occurred in New South Wales since 2019. There's no annual data. There's no demographic information about the types of women that are getting these abortions, of whether these abortions are increasing or decreasing, how old they are, what metro region they're from, their geographic locality, the reason for the abortion, the reason for the late-term abortions. None of this data is in the report. And in contrast, in places like Queensland, New South Wales and South Australia, you actually have annual reporting on abortion data. So you can see how many abortions there are every year. You can see what the reasons are for late-term abortions in Victoria and South Australia. South Australia produces the most comprehensive reports. They even release the complication rates of different types of abortion methods. None of this is in this 5-year report on the Abortion Law Reform Act that was introduced in 2019. And on the flip side, while there's no data, there's a hell of a lot of anecdote. There's so many quotes from pro-abortion insiders saying what they want. It's like their wish list of what they want the government to do. So let's take a deep dive now into this report. So the executive summary makes it clear that there were 35 written submissions from key stakeholder groups. These were organisations directly involved in the business of abortion, including expert advice from the New South Wales Health Safe Access to Abortion Care Working Group. So there's a specific working group that's been set up about abortion, safe access to abortion care. You can tell by their name, the normativity built into that name, safe access to abortion care. And the words abortion care are used throughout this report. So there's biased language all the way through in terms of how they frame and view abortion. It's not like when someone's doing heart surgery or getting treatment for diabetes. We don't need to call that diabetes care or heart surgery care, because we don't need to brainwash people. Everybody knows that when we're treating diabetes, that's healthcare, or when we're dealing with a heart surgery, that's healthcare. We're restoring a person back to health. But because abortion involves killing an innocent human being, a person with no voice or rights, we have to brainwash people. And the language in this report is abortion care. And whenever you see that, guys, whenever you see that in a media report or in an official government document, you know that the authors have been captured by a pro-abortion establishment. The report makes 3 recommendations. The first is that nurses and midwives should be able to administer chemical abortion drugs. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. The second recommendation it makes is that there should be new policy documents and training around conscientious objection. And the third is around making sure that there's better data notification. So let's deal with the first one first, because that's really the headline from this report, this idea that nurses and midwives should be performing chemical abortions. Now, a bit of a backstory. This was something that the Albanese Labor government introduced to enable greater access to chemical abortions around the country. They liberalised the regulation around it. So previously, you had to be a GP who had done extra training and certification to become registered to give out abortion pills, chemical abortion drugs. And this is called MS2-step, or you might have heard it referred to as mifepristone and misoprostol or RU486. They are all the same thing to refer to chemical abortions. So that was liberalised by the Albanese government because they wanted to enable nurses and midwives to be able to use it. But in order for that to actually happen, state governments have to make that happen. So pro-abortion state governments in the ACT, where you've got the Greens and Labor leading that government, Stephen Miles in WA, Stephen Miles in Queensland, Roger Cook in WA. Those pro-abortion Labor governments have all turned nurses and midwives into killers by allowing them now to prescribe these chemical abortion drugs. Chris Minns now has a proposal on his desk that should happen in New South Wales. Now, the problem with it is this. Nurses and midwives largely don't want to do this, which is actually the case with GPs. Less than 10% of GPs got registered to give out chemical abortion pills. They just don't want to go through that process of giving these drugs to women when they know that those drugs have a high complication rate. There's some dangers there for the woman, but it also kills the baby in utero. And I think a lot of GPs felt really uncomfortable with that. That's not a hypothesis. It's there in the evidence. Less than 10% of the 40,000 GPs nationally chose to give out chemical abortion pills. That meant that, there was less money for MS2 step. That meant that the abortion industry was having less abortion. So they've been lobbying to allow other actors to give out these drugs, nurses and midwives. Now, the problem with this is nurses and midwives haven't been trained to the extent that regular medical practitioners, GPs and obstetricians and gynecologists have been trained. So there's already a concern that you're getting people who have done a lot less training, are a lot less aware of the risks, and they're now giving out these drugs. The second issue is before you take a chemical abortion pill, you should have an ultrasound to make sure that the pregnancy is not ectopic, because the way these pills work is the first pill starves the nutrient supply to the baby. So they essentially stop being fed. The second pill forces the mother's body to expel the baby, and she essentially goes to the bathroom and delivers that baby onto the bathroom floor, which can be quite traumatic. There's a lot of blood. You often see your baby when you do that. Women aren't told this before they take these drugs. They're told often, like Teen Vogue referred to this as like a missed period kind of pill, which it clearly is not, because it kills a human being. But anyway, if you take one of these drugs and you're having an ectopic pregnancy, that is life-threatening. Your life is in danger because your baby is in your fallopian tubes rather than your uterus. And so expelling that baby from the fallopian tubes could literally result in it bursting, and you could lose your life. Like it's just so fundamentally dangerous. And yet in this report, they completely gloss over those safety concerns. In fact, surprise, surprise, the report says there was strong support amongst respondents that Section 5 of the Act should be updated in line with the TGA changes that allow nurses and midwives to give out these drugs. So that's not surprising, because all of these vested interest abortion providers that are giving submissions for this report, they get more money, they get more business if these pills are allowed to be administered by nurses and midwives. In fact, it costs Marie Stopes so much less money if they allow nurses and midwives to give out these drugs, because they don't have to pay the salary of a doctor. They can just pay the salary of a nurse or a midwife, which is significantly cheaper. However, in the fine print in the report, it does say that there was consent by two stakeholders regarding the business and safety risks of these drugs. One of the stakeholders says the diagnosis and exclusion of ectopic pregnancy prior to medical abortion is absolutely vital. But it can be difficult, and if it's missed prior to medical abortion being commenced, severe, potentially fatal complications may result. We believe that the clinical management of women undergoing medical abortion is beyond the scope of practice for nurses and endorsed midwives. So there's one or two stakeholders who have said something. Now, likely that's St Vincent's Hospital. That's the people who aren't performing abortions who have a concern about the safety risks of doing this. But then look at how the report authors gloss over that. They say these concerns were not broadly shared. And with respect to clinical safety, other respondents noted that they were not aware of any situations where expansion of eligibility of health practitioners to perform abortions within their scope of practice has led to any negative consequences. So this is literally just based on anecdote. They're just basically putting pro-abortion stakeholders, of which are the vast majority that have been consulted, and overbearing them over the top of the one or two voices that are critical and raising the alarm about this dangerous proposal to turn nurses and midwives into killers. In fact, if we look at the data from the South Australian Abortion Reporting Committee from the most recent year, what it says is there's actually a 6% complication rate for women who took abortion drugs. Of the 198 women that had a complication in the most recent year, 192 of them had retained products of conception, and that's short form, what's code for saying bits of the baby were left inside. So that second pill that I told you guys about, that's got the task of getting the baby out of the woman's body. But for 192 women in South Australia last year, not all of the bits came out. And so what they needed to do was then get rushed to hospital to have a surgical abortion, which is a dilation and curettage, or dilation and evacuation, where they literally scrape out the contents of the woman's uterus, the bits of the baby and pregnancy tissue that were left behind. If that doesn't happen, it's potentially life-threatening for women, and it can result in them dying because it can be sepsis and it can literally go bad really, really, really fast. So, in fact, a peak body of obstetricians and gynecologists came out last year when the Albanese government was removing all of the safety requirements around these pills, and they said, we're really concerned about this. And one of the OBGYNs from this group said that, one of his patients that he dealt with had been flown in from a regional area, and he had to operate on her very quickly in order to save her life. So none of this is in the report from New South Wales Health, which seems to be a complete stitch-up trying to push this new proposal to turn nurses and midwives into killers by giving them the ability to perform these chemical abortions. The second part of all of this, which I've just alluded to, is not just the risk of ectopic pregnancy, it's not just the risk of the complication rate, it's that you should be within 2 hours distance of an emergency hospital department. And yet the whole pro-abortion campaign being waged by these academics and the Sydney Morning Herald and the Guardian is that women need access to these chemical abortions, and yet they're trying to push this for women in rural and regional areas, but the health system in those areas is so woefully understaffed and inadequate that if women are just being given these chemical abortion drugs that they're taking in the safety of their own home, they are less likely to have access to good emergency care. And it could be life-threatening for some of these women, and women have died because of chemical abortion pills. We know that from situations in Australia, but we also know that from the US, where there's more publicity about these women who have lost their life because of these drugs that they have taken. And yet that doesn't stop the media, does it? So once this report landed, it clearly had been leaked to pro-abortion journalists, and the Sydney Morning Herald had a big story. And listen to what they said. They said, free and timely abortion access is virtually non-existent across most of New South Wales. I mean, that's not independent, impartial media reporting, is it? It's a normative statement that should be in an opinion piece. Free and timely abortion access. So why should abortion be free? And what is the basis for saying it's virtually non-existent across most of New South Wales? This article then goes on to say only one hospital in the state, John Hunter in Newcastle, has a formally funded surgical abortion service, predominantly for women in their first trimester. And then it says only a handful of surgeons perform surgical abortions after 15 weeks. But what the article doesn't say is the reason there's very few places, in fact only one place you can go for a surgical abortion, is because doctors don't want to do it. As I said in the second episode of my show on the fake abortion access crisis, the reason there's this crisis is because, and that's crisis in inverted commas for those of you who are listening online, the reason there's this crisis is because doctors don't want to break a baby's body apart with metal forceps and then extract a baby out in pieces. They just don't want to do that kind of work, which is why there's only one hospital in New South Wales with that surgical option. And so the Sydney Morning Herald doesn't write that in their article, and neither does New South Wales Health when they're writing this report. And so the second recommendation of the report is to say that there needs to be some new policy, guidelines and training around conscientious objection. And essentially what they say in this report is that there's too many conscientious objectors and that they're not referring on. And as a result, women aren't accessing these abortions. But what they don't say, what they don't look at is why. Why are there so many conscientious objectors? And what is the basis of their conscientious objection? Because New South Wales Health and Ryan Parks and Chris Minns and the Greens all have a normative view that abortion should be available up until birth and for any reason, it's abortion care. They don't want to ask the question about why nobody wants to do it. They just want to force everybody to do it. And so when they say the recommendation of this report is to provide more training and more guidance and more policy documents, what they mean is more pressure. They want to impose more pressure on their health workers who are already so stretched coming out of the pandemic. And there's been so many stories time after time again in the media about the health system being in crisis. And what Chris Minns and Ryan Parks and the Greens, Amanda Cohn, want to do is they want to put more pressure on nurses, midwives and doctors who don't want to perform abortions. They don't want to be involved in killing innocent human beings, and they want to put more pressure on them to do it. And that's essentially what the second recommendation in this Stitch Up report says. And then the third thing that this report says is that data collection's really bad. People aren't reporting the data fully on abortion. And that should be a huge red flag for all of us, that we've introduced this system of abortion up to birth and we don't even have robust data on what's going on. And then what's really telling is in this report, you've got all these abortion providers like MSI saying, well, actually, we just think the data requirement is too onerous and it should be removed altogether because it's preventing us from giving proper care to women because there's just too many papers that we need to fill. I mean, that's insane that would be the type of thing that they think they could say and get away with. But of course they can, because The Guardian, the SMH, they're never going to expose Murray Stopes. That's up to me on this independent channel. And so, I think it's crazy that the abortion industry gets away with saying we want less scrutiny. Thankfully, the report doesn't go down that direction. They say, okay, we need to put more effort into collecting the data. So I think that is a positive in the report that they recognise that. But all in all, this report is a joke. It's not an evidence base for anything. It should not be the basis for any of the reforms that it recommends. If anything, what New South Wales Health needs to do is produce another report. They need to go back to the drawing board. They should tell us the data on the number of abortions and how they've increased or decreased and what the complication rates are. We need that data from 2019 to the present day. We then need a robust survey of health workers and how they're experiencing this system. We need some sense of how and why these abortions are occurring and what are the driving factors for women, and can we address them through other means. We need some acknowledgement of the human rights of these children who are being killed up until birth, and we want to know the reasons why they're being killed. We want to know if it's eugenics, if it's because they've got some kind of disability. We want to know if it's because of their gender. There was a big concern in New South Wales in 2019 about sex-selective abortions, about girls being killed just because they're girls. And so we want to know, is that happening in New South Wales? And yet there's none of that in this report. I need your help, guys. We need to urgently tell Chris Minns, do not let this happen in New South Wales. We don't want nurses and midwives being turned into killers because of a campaign by the pro-abortion establishment. Sign my open letter to Chris Minns. Share it with friends. This can't happen under our watch. If it does happen, we will see more babies brutally killed. We will see women's health at risk, and we will see health workers being turned into killers when that is the last thing they want to do. Thank you for joining me today on the show, and I look forward to seeing you next time on The Dr. Jo Show.